Hi, I hope you're well, and I hope I'm not the only one who's been thinking about the genre of horror as a whole. Scary books, scary stories, creepypastas, movies. The genre really knows no bounds, but it's always bound by one thing, and that is the fact that it's fake, it's fictitious. These stories aren't actually real, when the axe murderer is dismembering a woman, it's fake blood they're using, and when there's a scary monster on screen, it's a costume that a man is in. But when a director or whoever made this media you're consuming is really skilled with their work, you might feel goosebumps when a certain scary scene comes up. There might even be a chill that runs down your spine, and I want to know why that is. If it's not real, then it can't hurt you, logically. There isn't any danger. So what I'm wondering is, why is it still scary? I've watched a lot of horror content over the past few years. I've basically grown up on scary movies, so this is a really interesting question to me. I have a theory about the answer, but it's also kind of boring, so I'm going to cover all my bases here. Let's talk about fear. Fear is a chemical response. It happens in your brain, the amygdala specifically, and you can't choose to feel it or not feel it. When you do feel fear, it works together with the hippocampus to kind of put this fear into context. When this fear response is triggered, it consults your hippocampus because it's responsible for learning and memory. So it kind of asks this part of the brain, is this fear rational? Should I be feeling this way? And the hippocampus can either quell this fear or justify it. Let's say when you were a kid you got stung by a wasp. It really hurt, so the memory sticks out in your mind. It sticks out to your hippocampus. So later on in life, you accidentally almost step on a wasp, and your amygdala triggers your fear response. Well, when it consults your hippocampus, it's going to remember that when you were a kid, you got stung by a wasp. So therefore, that fear is going to be justified. You have that fear of pain in your mind. Your amygdala will respond appropriately. It'll release a flood of neurochemicals and hormones, adrenaline and cortisol mainly, and this is where something very interesting to me happens. The fear, it turns physical. Your heart rate might spike to allow more blood into your muscles, your breathing might speed up to get more oxygen through your body. It's all preparing you for action, flight, fright, or freeze. I'm sure you've heard of that. Now, the reason this fear response happens, the reason why it's so strong, is because it's hardwired into us ever since our existence. These fear responses have kept us alive. These fear responses are coded into us strictly for survival. But nowadays, we don't really use this fear response for survival. If you're watching this indoors, in the air conditioning, in a comfortable environment, you'll probably know that firsthand. In fact, I'm willing to wager that you haven't really been in very many life or death scenarios this whole week. Now that's an interesting thing to me, because now that we don't really need to use this fear response for survival, some people are using it for a very interesting thing, and that's where horror comes in. People who enjoy horror movies, mainly ones with a lot of jump scares, I find they're using this fear response for something not unlike what people use in very dangerous sports. Thrill-seeking. Jump scares are loud and unexpected, and when they happen, it's usually at the quietest part of a movie, where it could be even in a very intimate scene where it's just you looking at a single character. Things could get so quiet you really have to listen in and pay attention to what's going on, and then when it's the most quiet, you think you can't even hear anything at all, and you really have to crane your neck to hear what's going on. When you least expect it, out of the blue, suddenly. The point is, jump scares are loud and sudden. I'm not going to actually jump scare you here, I'm not that mean, but I do think there is something to be said about how they work. Because they're so sudden, your amygdala doesn't really have time to consult your hippocampus. It kind of hacks your brain in that way, getting that fear response without really any work on your part. But the thing is, jump scares aren't really where I find the true horror in scary movies. If I'm gonna be completely honest, I don't really think jump scares are that scary at all. I think they're cheap and easy. I think there's a better way to make things scary, and there definitely is. Where I find the true horror in scary movies is in more quiet scenes where it challenges you on a psychological level. These scenes I'm talking about, they take time to develop and they prey on your most personal paranoias and fears. They tap into repressed memories and traumas that you've tried to keep at bay. This is where the true horror of horror movies lie for me. Take Midsommar, for example. Midsommar is a beautiful movie, and I think Florence Pugh does an incredible performance in it. But, there's not really many jump scares in it, but I think this movie is far scarier than any jump scare-filled flick could be, where Dani is mourning the death of her sister, or the Harga are silently manipulating her into falling for their cult. Those are what really gets to me. They Look Like People is another movie that deeply unsettles me. The main character, he struggles with this unlabeled psychotic disorder that separates him from reality. It makes it hard for him to tell what's real and what's not. This strains every relationship he's a part of, and it even puts strain on his relationship with his best friend. And, I don't want to spoil things, but towards the end of the movie, this kind of becomes a life or death situation for his friend as he desperately tries to prove to this man that he can be trusted and he's not a threat in any way. It's a very tense movie all throughout, and these scenes where there's a disconnect from reality and from what he experiences, these hallucinations he has, these voices he hears, it's very deeply unsettling to me. I would say that plays into a more primal fear that everyone can relate to, and that being the unknown. Primal fears, or primordial fears they're also known as, are ones that most everyone can relate to because they're hardwired into our brains for survival. A complete, exhaustive list of these fears is kind of argued upon because I looked into some of these fears and I don't really feel all of them, but the ones that I found most common were fear of darkness, fear of death, pain, isolation, and the unknown. The uncanny valley effect also plays into one of these primal fears, at least that's the theory. This phenomenon has only relatively recently come into popular attention, but I think it presents a very interesting theory. Now, the phenomenon itself, I believe it started back when artificial intelligence first grew popular. When people began to make these robots, they thought that maybe they could make them in the likeness of humans. Only this is where the uncanny valley effect really took place, because these imitations of humans, they had a certain strangeness about them. Many people reported being unsettled by them. There's some kind of odd quality to them that rang alarm bells in their head that made their survival instincts feel that something wasn't quite right here. This is where it plays into an interesting theory. That theory being, one of our primal fears is a fear of predators, and at some point in our past as humans, there was once a predator hunting us that sought to imitate us. Let's go back to Midsommar. That film was directed by Ari Aster, and if you know anything about Ari Aster's other works, you'll know he has some other pretty psychologically challenging movies under his belt, one of which is a movie by the name of Hereditary. This movie is still infinitely unsettling to me, but like Midsommar, it doesn't have a lot of jump scares, but it still deeply unsettles me. Take, for example, Peter's relationship with his mother as it slowly deteriorates after the death of Charlie. There's a certain anger, a rage even, and grief underneath it that precipitates into something truly nasty. And especially with the performances through which they are conveyed, it's something that sticks with me even after the movie is long over. While jump scares are sudden and brief, they stay in your mind for just as long, but themes like these, Charlie's death, such a young child, and the way that Dani was manipulated by the cult to turn on her own boyfriend and send him to his death, these are the things that stick with you beyond the movie. Unfiction is another form of horror that I quite like, and its goal is to deceive you in a way. it never explicitly states that it's fake, and it can take on the form of anything, really. It can take on the form of news broadcasts or YouTube channels, and a huge goal of these unfiction projects is to make you believe that they are real. These pieces of media can be very manipulative like that. They can even convince you that they are completely real at times, but a lot of them, I find, they do let the facade slip. Through mistake or intentionally, a lot of them let you know that, hey, this is an art project. Ultimately, it isn't real. But, I mean, I would argue that that doesn't matter. Whether it's real or fake, it's not really important at all. When an aspect of a horror movie really resonates with us on a personal level, I don't think there's any debating whether or not it's real or fake. The emotions we feel during these movies, regardless of what triggered them, we still feel these emotions. These emotions are real. The emotional connection we create with these movies, the memories we draw to make these connections even, that is what makes these pieces of media more impactful than they could ever be on their own. And that is where these pieces of media really become real. It doesn't matter if this horror movie or story is technically real, because at the end of the day, in a certain way, it's real to us. It's real to the people who watch it. Maybe you've heard of something called tulpas. They're not really scientifically accepted as an existing thing, but the idea behind them is that they're not unlike imaginary friends. They can be thought of by a person or a group of people, and that is how they become real. Through thinking upon them, they can develop into their own thing. They can develop their own personalities. They can become their own people, essentially. And I think the theory around that really ties into what I'm trying to say here. This theory being that your thoughts alone are actually enough to conjure something into reality, even if it only exists as something inside your head. Horror movies, they may not be real. They may be fictitious, they may simply be pieces of art created by directors and actors, but in some way, the horror, when you connect to it, it is made real. I think in a way, this reality, this connection is what makes things really scary, even if they're not technically real. But the thing about that is, while a lot of people might think this fear isn't actually good to have, I think it kind of is. I think fear can be an excellent motivator. Maybe you're in a situation that's unsafe, somewhere you shouldn't be. Maybe it's time to move on to a different stage in life. I think fear can really help you live to your fullest potential. Of course, too much fear can manifest in disordered anxiety, and it can affect every part of your life, but I think there is a healthy amount of fear that can be achieved. So with that, I'm gonna say, stay scared. It's good for you.